I'd like to go over the setup for concrete now. What you see here is a setup for a patio. They're getting ready to pour. It's up against a pool and a retaining wall here. The most important thing for concrete, and I can't stress this enough, is that it is very well supported. If you get any kind of movement underneath your patio, you're likely to get cracking, and the more the movement, the more severe the cracking will be. Now, we use rebar, and that helps hold the concrete together when there is movement or cracking, but nonetheless, we want to minimize the movement. We put control joints in the concrete. Those are those score lines you see in concrete, and they create a weak point that we hope that the concrete will crack down inside of that joint. But nonetheless, if you get too much movement, it's likely that those cracks will occur in places other than just the control joints. So what you see here is a prep where the Class 2 aggregate base that's specified on your concrete spec sheet, we have 4 inches of Class 2 aggregate base. It's been compacted and it's been wet and compacted. The specification calls for 95% compaction, so that's very, very hard. You almost need a hammer to claw through this to see what the thickness is. So I've come in and I've checked here to see that they have their 4 inches of base rock, which they do, and I like to spot check a few different places in the yard just to make sure that that's consistent throughout. Another important point for the setup of this base rock is that the top is uniform. If you have undulations in the base rock, you're also going to have inconsistencies in the thickness of your concrete. The thin spots that creates will cause cracking potentially from underneath. So it's real important that the top of this base rock has been vibroplated and has a uniform level to it. That way you have a uniform thickness throughout your slab and it doesn't create any weak points. Also, we have our dobies. The dobie assures that the rebar floats at a uniform height within the slab of the concrete at about 2 inches. So if we have a 4-inch slab, that's going to have that rebar floating in the middle of your slab for you. Also, it's important that you put enough of these in. We specify 36 inches on center, and you'll see that this cage is really supported well. When they pour that concrete on top, if these are spaced too far apart, this rebar will sag, and you'll get inconsistencies in where the rebar sits inside the slab. Another important point, it's a detail, but it is important, is that the wire ties for this and how they join the rebar together, these will rust, as you can see here. If these are sticking up and they're near, when they pour the concrete, they're near the surface of the concrete, you'll actually have rust appear through the top of your concrete, and it'll seem strange. You may not know where it's coming from, but it's from these being too shallow. So it's important that your contractor turn all of those down, and that way they're below the surface far enough. Over here, we have a polyvoid expansion joint, and you're going to see that in your concrete expansion joint detail. We've talked about that, and you can see that the finish result with the mastic. So what this is the slab will butt up against this like so, and then they will tear this top piece away, and that's where the mastic or the caulking will be poured on top. This is a spongy material so that when the concrete pushes up against it during expansion, it has some give to it. So that should be wherever your concrete butts up against a hard surface, such as a retaining wall or the pool edge or against the footing of a house, something that has no give to it, you want to make sure you put expansion joints in those locations. This is a good example of a concrete base and walkway that's been set up to receive tile or stone inlay. So as you can see, there's a concrete border around the edge, has some color in it, and then that will match up with the stone or the tile that they use as the inlay here. It's important that there's a 4-inch base of concrete though underneath the whatever material is going to go here. So make sure that your contractor allows for that in the thickness when they formed it up, that there's still a full 4 inches of concrete. So they have to recess that a little more than the edges to allow for that. That way, the concrete will stay solid and be held together, and if there's any cracking that goes through the concrete, it will usually crack right through your tile or your stone, so we want to make sure we've got the full thickness underneath our tile or stone. Concrete finishes come in a number of different types. One of our favorite types of concrete finishes is called a sand wash finish, and this patio is an example of that. When I specify a sand wash finish, what that should look like is a nice texture of, you can barely see the grains of sand inside the concrete itself. It keeps it from being a slippery finish, and that way it doesn't have any texture such as with a light broom finish or a salt finish. So here we see a nice example of sand wash. You can just see the grains of the sand. There's enough texture there so it's not slippery, and yet it's very smooth and goes nicely with stucco homes. This concrete finish is called exposed aggregate. As you can see, the pebbles are laid into the concrete, and then when they're almost dry, they wash off the layer of concrete on top and expose the aggregate or the pebbles that you see here. I really like this finish when it's complementing something like a stone. As you can see here, it's a very nice warm coloration, and that enhances the look of the stone border. One of the things to be sure of when they're doing exposed aggregate is to make sure that they fully expose the aggregate or the pebbles. Now, it's a fine line between overexposing the aggregate. If they wash too much of the concrete away that's holding these pebbles in place, they'll actually start to pop out over time. On the other hand, if they don't wash enough of it off, you'll get a very dull look to your concrete, and you'll actually won't see as many of the pebbles, which give it its rich look. In this case, the contractor also chose to use a sealant. Some concrete, I think that's appropriate, but in this case, the pebbles are so hard that they don't receive the sealer into their pores. It's just too hard of a material, so I don't recommend that for this type of finish. The other potential downside to that is that when that sealer sits up on top of these pebbles, you'll see a sheen, which looks kind of unnatural to my eye, but also it makes these pebbles very slippery, and we don't want that because of liability reasons, but more importantly, we just don't want anybody slipping on our walkways.